I'd like to move on and introduce our next speaker, Paul Gilroy. It's difficult to put in words how grateful we are you're here. And I really want to thank you, Paul, for undertaking this really complicated journey, despite all the strikes of whatever airports and railway companies. Thank you, I appreciate it. Paul Gilroy is a sociologist and a writer. He is currently the Anthony Giddens Professor of Social Theory in the Sociology Department at the London School of Economics in London. We're extremely happy that he's spending some time in Utrecht regularly this year as the inaugural holder of the Treaty of Utrecht Chair, hosted by former West partner, the Center for the Humanities here at Utrecht University in Utrecht. His wide-ranging and highly influential publications include Darker Than Blue on the Moral Economies of Black Atlantic Cultures from 2009, After Empire, Melancholia or Convivial Culture from 2004, Against Race, Imagining Political Culture Beyond the Color Line from 2001, and The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness from 1993. Gilroy lives and works in London. Thank you again, Paul, for being here, and the floor is yours. For you, then it's easier, no?
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. My apologies to Sarat that the Chaucerian nature of my journey prevented me from hearing what you had to say earlier on. Is this an appropriate moment to deliver congratulations to the European art world on its increasingly cosmopolitan character, to applaud nascent multiculture as an antidote to the conceits of civilizationism? Artists and newly professionalized curators do seem now to be leading and hosting a conversation about alterity and plurality, citizenship and denizenship that is richer than anything that increasingly corporate academic bodies and networks can offer. Virtual exhibitions are bringing the work of diverse artists from the developmentally arrested world into an expanded marketplace which includes Chinese collectors. Financial collapse and environmental catastrophe aside, everything appears rosy in Europe's post-Soviet garden. I think we should beware of a Europe-centeredness which contradicts cosmopolitan aspirations. And I want to begin by saying that I'm extremely uncomfortable with the idea that a kind of epochal collapse of the Soviet system and the attendant restructuring of European national states can be adequately understood as issues that are comfortably internal to Europe's progressive telos. It's certainly not the case that recent history is just another happy index of steady linear movement towards perfection. Similarly, I must also respectfully suggest that the idea that this nicely, attractively fortified island of overdevelopment can now be considered as a former West, I think that is a misplaced, perhaps deluded piece of wishful thinking. Indeed, the things that we want to interpret as former West, as post-Western even, might only represent Europe's need to manage the stresses of the present moment, to keep its culture, its overdeveloped civilization, as reassuringly clean as possible. And the pursuit of exotica provides a welcome means to clean up the mess of post- and neo-colonial Europe's belligerent relationship with the rest of the world. Now, the West, for me, is a particular historical and cultural construction that can be traced to two 16th century events which revealed the disaggregation of Christendom, the Reformation and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. And it's only very rarely performed a simple geographical function, being bound instead to a pattern of political ontology, which culminated in the deeply racialized concepts that we all know from 19th century Europe's imperial phase. Painfully, we recall Hegel's identification of Africa with historylessness, and of India and China with stagnation, despotism. But we pass over his view of the West as the land of the future without comment, because it too often coincides with the imaginative geography of our own time. During the 20th century, the West comes to refer primarily to capitalism's dominant power, the United States, and its needs to differentiate itself from the communist system. However, the exclusionary elements, the oversimplifications, the pieties that have been articulated with earlier figurations did endure. The most recent decades altered those formations significantly. However, the racial significations, the teleologies and topographies derived from a kind of Hellenomaniacal German romanticism, endorsed in the imperial fantasies of Ruskin and Rhodes, and then buttressed by the neo-Kantian writing of Veblen and his ilk, remain with us. And they've been reformulated recently exactly as Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis suggested in a powerful civilizationist discourse, a discourse that redefines the West by presenting Islam as the successor to the problems represented previously by a Soviet threat. So let's remember, and I'm sure that you've passed over this, but I missed it because I was delayed on my way here, that our discussion today we must acknowledge that it takes place in the context of a war, a raging war, an info war, an apparently endless global counterinsurgency campaign which has made culture itself a new and important field of conflict. And we might spend our time most productively if we use it to prepare for the fact that in that context, the West is resurgent, even if it is not exactly in a healthy state. And that, for me, is the likeliest outcome of a new engagement with the critical fruits of postcolonial thinking. The reanimation of Christendom and the consolidation of a clash of civilizations into a banal but potent common sense idea capable of explaining almost any political event have made the West into a rather more dynamic and rather more durable entity than our title for our conference suggests. And I think a similarly negative verdict is supported by my own rather informal ethnographic observations on the everyday business of one major London art institution on whose advisory council I sat until very recently, where the most lively topic of conversation was a regular debate as to which of several contending Russian oligarchs would be able to serve as major donors to the museum without bringing it political embarrassment. Postcolonial theory is rather too exclusively literary enterprise for my taste. It has few correlates in the field of arts and culture, and they usually choose to overlook the idea that neo-colonial relations are being invented, are being moralized, as the only possible developmental path mapped out by failed governments, pre-modern states, terrorist enclaves, chaotic zones, and we cannot pass that possibility by. Nor should we allow the vibrant critical legacy bequeathed to us by the generation of decolonization to lapse into a kind of anodyne multiculturalism, even if in these grim times that minimal enterprise is a measure of hope and possibility. Perhaps as critics of capitalism and Soviet communism, we might be alert to the continuing activities of the Ministry of Love. War is now peace, and ignorance is strength, even if the glittering epiphany of President Obama would have us believe that freedom need not be slavery. The securitocracy around us, even, and I don't here only mean the Schengen version of this, there are other versions of it too, has made it harder and harder for non-EU artists and cultural workers of all kinds to gain access to the institutions and markets of this would-be former Western Europe. And that same securitocracy aspires to dimensions of total political power that the Soviet system could never deliver. We are governed now by people, even here, even in this country, who not only believe that anything is possible, but also that they, the wise few, are uniquely mandated to manufacture and order reality in their own interest through a philosophically grounded repertoire of noble lies. And the extent of that operation takes us some distance beyond either Machiavelli or Edward Bernays. Among serious students of a history and theory of decolonization, and its political and economic consequences, that rather neurotic insistence on their civilizing mission to reorder the imagination and the world alike is likely to be read as a symptom of the fact that Euro-American dominance of our planet is coming to an end. In the meantime, the overdeveloped world hosts a technoscape which has accommodated, as Boris has pointed out, a new politics of information and of truth. New varieties of responsibility at this point descend upon those whose work producing and circulating images and other artworks is the substance of our conference. The politics of seeing has been altered by processing technologies, and the corporate stockpiling of images is generating a novel set of conflicts around the desire to manage things like copyrights as a new variety of capital. More than that, additional problems arise from a cultural mood of having seen it all, of being deadened, of being unmoved, even by the distracting excess of visual stimulation, real and horrific, hyperreal, simulated, enhanced, crude and uncut. Pornography saturates sociality. And for me, the novelty of this situation is confirmed by the unfolding of the info war. Visual material doesn't, as it once did, stand outside or supplement conflict that's been determined somewhere else. It's now an integral element within the war effort. The orchestration of information has become an ever more highly skilled operation. And the central relationship to power, of power to knowledge, is transformed. A different relationship between ignorance and power starts to take precedence. The info war places a heightened premium on secrecy, which has been expanded to accentuate the tension between things that cannot be known and things that cannot be seen. Smart power, which these days, according to the chairman of the World Bank anyway, includes what they now call Facebook diplomacy, aspires to a complete control of visual culture, and through that, the mastery of human imagination and dreamscape. I think we must concede the growing inadequacy of older critical approaches based upon too simple a distinction between being seen and being invisible. Instead, we perhaps have to contest the terms of visibility, the political and legal and economic conditions within which particular regimes of visuality can be reproduced. The US government becomes a private client of the Satellite Imaging Corporation, whose digital eyes cover Afghanistan. Their human terrain system ensures that anthropologists are now embedded in the tanks with the warriors, in the latest sequence of doomed military adventures, novel only in being warranted by the liberal goals of redeeming gender equality. Vulnerable gays and young women are to be protected with cluster bombs, depleted uranium shells, and a new system of banking, apparently based entirely on mobile phones, that double as cameras and screens for photographing yourself instead of circulating video clips of the latest war crimes and collateral damage. One recent dispatch from the front line of this conflict was captured, let me quote it briefly, captured this situation neatly. I'm quoting here. Things reached a peak when the soldiers spotted a young man with a neatly trimmed goatee beard, apparently snapping photographs with a cell phone camera. They stopped him. They made sure the pictures were deleted from his phone, digitally scanned his irises and fingerprints with a biometric automated toolset scanner. He was not detained, but now he was in their system. So the proliferating products of what one theorist, an Australian, of this new global counterinsurgency calls armed social work, cannot really be consumed innocently. And there is no public good underpinning the versions of news that fuel this infotainment. The best thing that can be said about that filtered product, which emerges from these new alignments, is that its partiality promotes what we might think of as a melancholic indifference from which we have to seek liberation. Most of its effects, though, are much more corrosive than that, and it exists within a demotic culture of uploading and networking, which specifies different possibilities of truth-telling and moral fidelity. Yes, we do need to know what's really going on, but the greater quantity of information that's now available to us doesn't make it any easier to discover. The truth effect of images becomes harder to fix, their digital code becomes easier to process, alter, and manipulate. Can I have my slide, please? The coalition forces fighting in Afghanistan is a rather useful initial guide to the architecture of this neo-colonial West. As you see, their number includes the Dutch, the Danes, the Turks, the Jordanians, and the Icelanders. Although I rang my friends in Iceland and asked them to see if they could find out what it was the Icelanders were actually doing there, and nobody knew the answer. As well, of course, as a number of post-Soviet and non-European nations. Happily, though, Boris, there are no Japanese self-defense soldiers committed there as yet. Where does this new historical actor, blundering around in the dusty graveyard of the Soviet system, leave this West? Perhaps looking more carefully into that conflict, looking more carefully into the struggles in the other Badlands, places like Somalia and Congo and Sudan, might tell us something useful about the viability, the durability of this entity that we may have been a little bit too eager to bury. Even the Atlantic world is now reoriented, now accommodates novel patterns of south to north migration which demand renewed attention to Africa and its diasporas, its new ones, as well as to the fortification of Europe and the retrenchment of that securitocracy in the overdeveloped zones. Today's civilizationist thinking cannot be divorced from arguments for the legitimate revival of imperial rule, which is going, we're told, to be reconstituted in postmodern and voluntary forms. A sense of cultural crisis accompanies this, and it has been often directed generally against Islam rather than specifically at Islamism, a telling ambiguity which supplies the primary context for additional alarming changes. It's premised upon the failure, of course, of multiculturalism, a term which now functions as a kind of catch-all phrase for unwanted plurality and cultural diversity, which would entail only loss, risk, and weakness. The invocation of an undiluted Western sameness is extremely deceptive. It encodes unwholesome desires for racial uniformity and national similarity. And a better outcome for our debates about culture in the unmaking of the West, art in the unmaking of the West, lies not in the comforts of ethnic unanimism or national seriality, but with an affirmation of the open quest involved in limitless human curiosity that promotes a cosmopolitan orientation, vernacular rather than statist, ordinary rather than exotic. From that utopian position, encounters with this omnipresent alterity might involve something different than fear and anxiety. They might even supplant the mosaic plurality in which each beautiful fragment of cultural difference is isolated, separate, and meaningful within the larger picture of society that it helps to assemble. A model being exported into Europe that only corresponds to the unique immigration history and racial nomos of the post-colonial United States of America. The hidden component driving on today's neurotic deliberation over cultures and civilizations is, of course, that great need to specify exactly who may now count as Western and what that attachment is going to involve in insecure and unsettling conditions. Instead of reading and writing and debating in order to discover who we are and what we will become, we are asked to establish and then to enforce fixed identity as a precondition of belonging to our state and as a starting point for the pursuit of that ephemeral universality, which has been the historic counterpart of that political attachment. As far as Europe's future is concerned, the unprocessed colonial past can intervene on either side of civilizationism's culture lines to make the current political situation more hazardous and more intractable. An overdue coming to terms with the consequences of departed colonial power is not just a way to make these past problems wrought by racial hierarchy and imperialism visible. It's also a means to bring those difficult issues out of the official domain of culture and to place them instead inside the world of politics. Democracy itself might even be enriched by facing up to the history of its debasement and its abbreviation in those colonial places. Of course, for several hundred years, the standard bearers of peace and conviviality and cosmopolitanism included notable critics of the moral and political costs of the West's criminal encounters with its colonial peoples. That beleaguered tradition allows for the unfashionable possibility today that the stranger, the alien, the denizen, the xenos, could be recognized as a human being, endowed with dignity that is not qualified by racial or ethnic hierarchy, and then placed under the obligation of hospitality. Today, even though we see that tradition in its proper historical setting, we must try, I think, against the odds, to revive it. We have to find a new application and to discover a new value for the practice of systematic estrangement from our own natal cultures. And perhaps, in that gesture, we might initiate something like the beginning of the end of the West. Freud articulated that stance as cosmopolitan disillusion. Before him, it arose at the intersection of artistic and anthropological concerns and subverted the proper ordering of national states, complicating their understanding of patriotism and solidarity, of the proper relationship between the human and the citizen. Today, this way of seeing and acting invites us into a better sense of culture as plural practice rather than a singular property, as vital event rather than moribund object. Now, Fanon, the Martinican revolutionary, is remembered not so much for his adaptation of a militant anti-Nazi morality to anti-colonial struggles, but for his still shocking view of colonial societies and for his affirmative view of the insurrectionary movements that arose everywhere to overthrow them. Perhaps it helps to recall for a moment that Fanon was a healer, a doctor, as well as a warrior. His insights can help us now that our cities host forms of segregation which are, in some respects, reminiscent of colonial conditions, and other dismal innovations drawn from the colonial laboratories are once again being imported into the life behind the heavily fortified walls of resurgent imperial overdevelopment. Fanon had been a beneficiary of the best education the French colonizers of the Caribbean could provide. Later, as a decorated veteran of the war against the Nazis, he argued that, in colonial settings, the brokenness of modernity had achieved uniquely destructive and damaging forms. An already unjust world was further corrupted by its absolute reliance upon the Manichaean divisions for which race was emblematic. The violent situation that resulted not only made politics impossible, it was psychologically and experientially toxic to its beneficiaries as well as to its victims. It alienated both settler and native. It damaged the torturer and the tortured. And he thought that the different forms of human injury experienced by those shifting, open groups could be said in a complex way to have acquired a complementarity. Fanon's uncomfortable insights become relevant here because he insisted that the motionless social order of the colony was firmly and comprehensively compartmentalized. If we examine closely the system of compartments, I'm quoting him now, we will at least be able to reveal the lines of force it implies. The colonial world is cut in two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks, shown by police stations. The policeman and the soldier are the official, instituted go-betweens. Well, of course, we can add the airport to that list now. The dissident psychiatrist concluded by making his central point about the relationship of power to law and space in the colonial city. The world, cut in two, is inhabited by two different species. This is not an anticipatory endorsement of the clash of civilizations, let me emphasize. The contending forces in this conflict are not just different versions of the same essential elements and attachments. This conflict is between asymmetrical forces. The dividing lines are not straight. Power flows in varying configurations on different scales. Divisions, always marked by violence, move through as well as between the dubious civilizations which produce culture in order to draw the fatal line. Well, securitocracy and infowar have made that battle now a battle without an ending. Colonial government and immigration laws provide an initial toolkit for managing the supposedly exceptional arrangements that suspend legality in legality's name. And the drama begins in earnest when the prisoners have been taken and their primal vulnerability appears to test the credentials of civilization found on our side of the line. And now we've been engulfed by the geopolitical conditions of the war on terror. It's become important and worthwhile to revisit Fanon, particularly in his essays, which do not sound anachronistic in a post-Cold War world. His many insights reveal him unexpectedly, perhaps, to be our contemporary. His essays might be read profitably as a series of difficult and provocative questions about history of the present, the significance of racism in European social life, the character of post-colonial politics, not just in Africa, but in all the other places where Europe's colonial crimes are vividly remembered, even if Europe has contrived to forget them. Whatever resonance these writings may have had in the past, they now speak powerfully to our circumstances, to the integrity of the West, to the questions of race and culture and multiculture, to the social projection of racialized phantoms, to the cohesion of contending civilization, and above all, to the vexed issue of the human in the contested discourses of human rights. Fanon's critique of the left's tepid response to the employment of torture in the Algerian context remains potent, and his grasp of the fundamental significance of torture in the conduct of colonial warfare alone justifies the close studies of his work. Some of his essays seem to have been addressed to the conjuncture after the banlieue cows have burned out and France displayed again its pathological inability either to face the residual traces of its own ugly colonial history or to address the effects of the racism that distorts its political culture and so manifestly undermines its democratic ideals. Apart from those provincial matters, Fanon also helps to explain how the antique, the Manichaean conflict between cross and crescent has been revived and why it has been able to generate such powerful worldly forces around us. He offers a variety of conceptual tools and theoretical insights that can be said to illuminate the larger crisis of multiculturalism in post-colonial Europe, where the transition involved in being an immigrant seems to have lapsed into a permanent condition that stretches now across the generations. Much has to be gained from revisiting Fanon. His writings offer enduring, though unfashionable, insights into the workings of racialized identity, and in particular into the costs for both the victims and the perpetrators of operating in an epidermalized social and political environment where common humanity is, as he would put it, amputated. The critique of racial ontology that was spelled out poetically in his earliest writings is still very much in evidence in his last essays. And perhaps now that we've all seen the orange-suited detainees clustered in the Caribbean cages and the naked, bloodied bodies piled up to be categorized and photographed in Abu Ghraib, Bagram, Diego Garcia, it's easier to see what he might have meant by developing the idea that it is the racist who produces the infrahuman being as a racialized object. Let's remember, of course, they don't wear orange suits anymore. You won't see that photograph. And the reason you don't see it anymore is because it was judged not to be doing the work it was desired to do. That was a footnote. It should not be necessary to emphasize that for Fanon these are not conservative arguments. They're revolutionary sentiments which deliver us immediately to the fluid core of his impatient desire for a better, freer, and more dynamically human world than the alienated one for which, in spite of Manichaeism delirium, he urges us to assume a joint responsibility. Key essays like West Indians and Africans, Racism and Culture present elaborate and nuanced statements of his political thinking at its most iconoclastic, its most creative. These writings fill out their author's unshakable commitment to a revolutionary curiosity which had been announced at the end of his first book with the celebrated plea, "Oh, my body, make me always a man who asks questions." Fanon's most significant contributions might be the way that his essays that have been so neglected offer powerful protocols for the development of an anti-racism as a systematic interventionist practice that can foster convivial and post-exotic relationships with alterity. This is no longer what it was for him, some minor element in a larger theory of revolutionary political agency. In the years since his untimely death, it's become a substantive political problem in its own right. He puts what we would now probably call the global south right back into the center of accounts of the Cold War. He's alert to the agency of racism in moulding social and political life in the colonies and in the metropoles. Most importantly, he shows that if anti-racism is to be politically and morally compelling, it must do more than simply imagine that bad ideas can be pumped out of human consciousness to be replaced by better ones. In other words, he grasps the depth and the complexity of the cultural dimensions to colonial and, by extension, post-colonial conflicts. The growing inequality between the overdeveloped world and the rest threatens to compromise the ground on which a resurgent understanding of common humanity will eventually have to be erected. Other deeply uncomfortable words, accountability, responsibility, help to specify a humble engagement with humanity of the other people who've been locked out of the promises and the pathologies of overdevelopment. And it is that resolution which breaks the melancholic spell, cast all over Western Europe by the desire for a return to the greatness that vanished with departed imperial prestige. It is there too that we can begin to repeat Fanon's famous invitation to the willfully innocent beneficiaries of colonial domination in a novel context created by the more recent post-colonial histories, unworked through, unmourned. Let me quote him again. "Wake up, Put your thinking caps on and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty. However, in his post-exotic and unromantic telling of the old fairy tale, there is no kiss to be bestowed. Thank you.